Hello and welcome, I'm Dr. Tom Pepper and this is my video reviewing the recent debate between Vaush and journalist Tim Pool. A few notes before we begin. Firstly, this ended up not being as much of a debate as I was looking for. It really was more of an interview with Tim Pool asking Vaush questions, which he answered. But I think there was still a lot to get into here. There was still critical thinking, there was still logic, people used arguments, and that's my speciality here on this channel, so that's what I'm going to be looking at today. Just a bit of setup. The video version I watched was on a channel called The Surf Times, and the video was titled Battle of the Beanie. Sometimes I'm going to leave references here to when specific things happen in the video, so it's that video that I'm referring to. I couldn't find a version without commentary, but he's really unobtrusive. He's clearly on Vaush's side, but he doesn't get involved too much in the debate. First thing I want to talk about is their styles, because I think this is where Vaush really excelled, especially above the expectations I had of him. He was funny, charming, well-spoken, articulate. His arguments were good and rational and everything. I don't think Tim pushed him hard enough for him to really prove himself as a great debater because he wasn't up against that much of a challenge, but he did undoubtedly perform very well. Much better than he does on his own channel, I think, where he's often aggressive and he brings up way more logical fallacies on his own channel here. Tim's main problem when it comes to debating, and he's a fine interviewer, so no problems there, but his main flaw when it comes to debating is he doesn't really have a core, well-worked-out position of his own to criticize Vaush from. So he'll generally criticize some vague aspect of the left, Vaush will disavow that aspect of the left, and then Tim doesn't have really much to lean on. I don't think they're that far apart politically necessarily. One of the other original plans for this video was to keep like a running score of like big hits so we could add them all up at the end and see who won. Vaush won undoubtedly on like big hits. I got to about 5 big hits for Vaush before I just stopped counting and gave up on that aspect and just let it be a lot more general. But let me run down some of the big hits that I thought came out of about the first half of this video. 20 minutes in, they're talking about the coronavirus, and Vaush brings up 200,000 dead from coronavirus, which he blames on Trump's mismanagement. Tim Pool didn't really have a response for that, but they do come back to it later when it gets a lot more involved. At around 33 minutes, again, this is all from the Surf Times Battle of the Beanie video, Tim brings up the topic of why the state should give money to failing cities. Isn't that just going to encourage them to pursue bad policies? Vaush responds that withholding money from them isn't going to change their bad policies, and again, Tim doesn't really have a follow-up. At around 43 minutes, they're discussing Black Lives Matter, and Tim seems to move position to agree with Vaush that Black Lives Matter are justified in general. Tim then tries the class reductionist route by saying that these problems aren't really about race, they're actually about class, and Vaush agrees with that and just says, well, BLM is actually all about class. So they end up agreeing there, but it looks like Tim moved to meet Vaush. From around an hour and 2 minutes to about an hour and 9 minutes, Tim tries to land hits on the idea that Black Lives Matter are a violent organization. Vaush just keeps coming back with all the examples of right-wing violence. Now, of course, that doesn't actually excuse any violence from Black Lives Matter, but what it does do is allow Vaush to say, well, everyone has these problems. Black Lives Matter isn't a particularly violent organization, and there's no need to particularly focus on the violence that comes about in association with that group. And so it ended up being about 5-0 to Vaush at the last count. But by the end of the video, it would become substantially more because this video really started to break down when it got to about the 3-hour mark. If you don't like Tim Pool, or you're here to see Vaush own Tim Pool, that's the part you want to watch from. They start talking about coronavirus, Trump's response, and the 200,000 dead. And although I do think there are some arguments to be made in favour of liberty, individual rights, that kind of thing, to be weighed up against the harm from coronavirus, Tim wasn't really making those arguments. He just kept saying, we don't know what would have happened if things had been done differently, and he wasn't even willing to assume. He just really looked like he was playing hard defense for Trump, to the point where he just came across totally biased. He just wasn't willing to accept any criticism of Trump and just kept deflecting and putting it back onto Biden. As a more general point, there was a lot of that in this video. So you get a lot of what we call a two-quock fallacy, or something like the two-quock fallacy. Two-quock is normally when your opponent criticizes you and you respond by saying, well, you do it too, which obviously isn't a response at all because your own behavior isn't being excused there. You're just saying, well, yeah, I agree with you. I'm terrible, but so are you. This wasn't quite like that. It was more like, well, your guy does it too. So if someone criticized Trump, Tim would respond by criticizing Biden. And in the end, everybody looks bad. And again, I get it. It's an election year. It's election week, right? Everyone's focused on that instead of painting an honest picture of the world. But it did happen quite a lot. Not gonna lie, that last half hour, or like the 3-hour mark to the 3-hour 33 mark, which is when I stopped watching because that's when they went to the super chat, the Q&A session. I was kind of tearing my hair out because the quality of debate was really, really poor. And as I say, Vaush was better than Tim all the way through. But ultimately, everyone should want everyone involved to be good at debating because that's how you sharpen each other up. It's not much good seeing Vaush beat someone who isn't very good in a debate, because what does that prove? If you beat someone who's very bad at fighting in a fight, what does that say about you? Well, it says almost nothing. We're going to round off by looking at my main criticisms of Vaush, which I've grouped into sort of three main categories. The first one is him playing fast and loose with the left-wing, right-wing distinction, which he does to kind of confuse a few issues and kind of obfuscate the situation. The second point is going to be his response to Trump banning critical race theory in government institutions. And the third criticism is a much smaller one that's just going to say how Vaush contradicted himself on conspiracy theories, which I did a video on recently and is a passionate favourite topic of mine. So that first point then, Vaush playing fast and loose with the left-wing, right-wing distinction, that's really obvious at around the 1 hour, 14 minutes mark when they start talking about the book In Defense of Looting. Tim essentially says something like, they defend looting. Vaush responds with, who's they? Tim responds with, journalists, activists, and Vaush just goes, well, okay. And it's like, well, his point is correct then. There are elements of the left that justify and defend looting. This then flipped at the 34-minute, 22 seconds mark when they start talking about the plot to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer. Vaush's claim was that they couldn't be left-wing because they talked about killing communists or anarchists, I think, which doesn't really hold. You can easily have, I mean, history's full of examples of communists killing other communists. Like, the left is very factional. A lot of the factions don't get on. So it's completely possible these guys were left-wing. But it exhibits a general theme of Vaush just disavowing any negative elements of the left and just sort of saying, well, they weren't real leftists, while any criticism he makes of particular right-wing individuals doing something bad, that's taken to be representative of the right wing in general, or like it exhibits some sort of core defect at the heart of right-wing thinking. But he doesn't really justify that. He just ignores all these negative left-wing examples and really zooms in on the right-wing examples. It's kind of like what they call the no true Scotsman fallacy. Imagine a Scottish guy sitting in his house thinking that all Scottish people are great and saying they never do anything wrong, and then he reads about how a Scottish person, a Scotsman, committed a murder. And he just says, well, he was no true Scotsman then. So you see how he's got everything sewn up because he's defined Scotsman as a good person. So any counterexamples, well, they can't be real counterexamples because his ideal Scotsman would never do that. So Vaush has a similar sort of no true leftist technique where every time someone on the left does something wrong, he just says, well, they weren't really left-wing then, were they? And so Tim's main strategy of criticizing particular left-wing individuals to try and cast aspersions on the entire group never works because Vaush just disavows them and moves on. Vaush then continues making some pretty odd claims like saying CNN isn't left-wing, despite the fact they're obviously supporting Joe Biden. I don't think Joe Biden is particularly left-wing in the grand scheme of things, but he's on the left wing of American politics, to be sure. He also calls Tim far-right, which Tim doesn't really push back on, despite the fact that I don't think it's true from watching quite a bit of his content. I mean, he's pro-Trump, but I mean, he became famous through Occupy Wall Street, which was a famously left-wing economic movement. So this is all very important because Tim is basically letting Vaush set the stage for the entire debate, for the portions of this where they are debating. He's letting Vaush define the concepts, left-wing, right-wing, but Vaush's precepts are all based on those concepts. So Tim always ends up agreeing with Vaush in the end because Tim isn't a great debater and can't really take him on that sort of conceptual, deep level. He can only ever say, well, what about this thing I saw on the news the other day? So if someone was really debating Vaush, they want to get down to the nitty-gritty, well, what do you mean by left-wing? What do you mean by right-wing here? Because Vaush eventually does admit in the video that he doesn't think the left-wing, right-wing distinction amounts to much, but he sure does rely on it a lot to make his points. The second main criticism I have of Vaush was the section on critical race theory, which I understand Donald Trump has banned being taught in government institutions and at universities. There seemed to be some contention over whether it was being taught to staff or students in universities. And it was around this time, I think, that Vaush started getting a lot bolder with his assertions and realised Tim wasn't pushing back on any of them. So he got bolder and bolder in the things he was saying. So he compared banning critical race theory being taught in government institutions to Nazis burning books, which Tim didn't really push back on. It's like the analogy for Nazis burning books in Nazi Germany would be Trump burning books today, or like scrubbing things from the internet, right? That's the analogy for like the total removal of knowledge. And I think a real debater would have been able to go pretty hard on him here, particularly when Vaush is supposed to be pro-workers' rights. And the problem, of course, is not just that workers are being forced to go to boring seminars and stuff like that, but that stifles their freedom of thought and expression in the workplace. Because if your boss, the person who can fire you, makes it very clear, these are my political leanings, then there's an immense deal of pressure on any worker to conform to that and not say anything in the workplace that goes against that, which isn't good for freedom of thought or social liberalism at all. The minor point then I wanted to cover, in addition to the two major criticisms of Vaush, at around 1 hour 26, Tim Pool talks about the McCloskey case. The McCloskey were the sort of middle-aged couple you might remember quite early on in the BLM protest days. They got in some legal trouble essentially for brandishing firearms at a group of Black Lives Matter protesters. Tim brought up some, admittedly, a conspiracy theory about how the CIA or something had tampered with their weapons to prove something. And Vaush correctly said, well, it sounds like we're getting into conspiracy territory now, and sort of shut the conversation down. This was about, like, literally several minutes after he'd accused the CIA and the FBI of infiltrating Black Lives Matter protests to instigate violence and then make Black Lives Matter look bad by extension, which is also a conspiracy theory, and Tim didn't make that connection. If you're going to rely on conspiracy theories, you have to allow that they're part of the conversation. In conclusion then, the debate wasn't a debate, it was more of an interview. Where there was debating, I thought the quality was pretty poor. Tim was worse than I expected. Vaush was way better than I expected in terms of presentation, and he didn't make many mistakes or big screw-ups. Like, all those criticisms I just listed are across the course of like 3 hours. So he did do really well, he just wasn't up against much of a challenge, so he could really prove himself. And he really needs that kind of challenging competition so that his views can look better by comparison, if you see what I mean. It's no good making his views look better than Tim Pool's sort of ad hoc ramblings. The main takeaway I have from this really is from a video that Vaush posted on his channel recapping the debate after the fact, where he just said that he and Tim Pool got along really well, and that Vaush thought Tim was a grifter before that, but he doesn't anymore. He sees now that he's sincere in his views and he isn't just trying to make money. Obviously, they're very different politically, and it's a very contentious time politically in America, but they were able to, forget their differences and just have a good time. So if anyone takes anything away from this debate and from this particular video, I'd say it should be that you can always, no matter your political differences, just try and get along with people and have a good time, because that's what life is actually about. Thank you very much for watching. Be sure to like the video if you liked it, subscribe to the channel if you'd like to get more content. As I say, a more critical video of Vaush's channel and sort of his general political philosophy and his argumentation will be coming up shortly, so do subscribe so you get a notification for that. Share with anyone you think might like it, and leave a comment. What did you think of the debate? Did you think Vaush won like I did? Or do you think Tim was better than I thought he was? What are your opinions? The next time I see you, we might all be living in a very different Biden-led world. Until then, stay happy, and I'll see you then. Goodbye.